Hello, fellow innovators. This is Patrick Emmons.
And this is Shelley Nelson.
Welcome to the Innovation and the Digital Enterprise Podcast, where we interview successful visionaries and leaders, giving you an insight into how they drive and support innovation within their organization. Today, we're welcoming Fred Lee to the show. Fred is a Chief Technology Officer at Amount. Amount is a leading technology provider for financial institutions. Prior to Amount, Fred held senior leadership positions at a variety of Chicago-based companies, including Chief Technology Officer for Cars.com, Gamut, and Belly. He also served as Chief Information Officer for Innova and Vice President of Digital Architecture for Grainger. Fred earned his BS in Industrial Engineering from Purdue University and his JD from the Loyola University Chicago School of Law. Welcome to the show, Fred.
Yeah, hey, thank you. Happy to be here. Honored to be here.
Fred, if you don't mind, can you share with our listeners a little bit more about Amount and your role there?
Yeah, sure. So Amount. Okay, so we are officially about a 2.5-year-old startup. And I say officially, I'll kind of come back to that a little bit because it's got a bit of an interesting history. And our mission and our goal is to help, at this time, banks and financial institutions just digitize their services and their offerings. We believe that there is, change happening in how people will experience banking. For example, my kids will probably never step into a retail bank location. I personally can't think of the last time I've done that. And they think of financial services as almost like app functionality, right? So they know, for example, Venmo allows me to send somebody money, but they don't think of that as a banking thing or a financial service. They think of it as like an app function. And that's interesting because that's how technology has kind of like lowered barriers and democratized these capabilities. And the truth is that banks have lots of opportunity to do this for their customers and their users. And, we're excited to be a part of that.
That's pretty exciting stuff. And so the challenge that you're dealing with is trying to democratize banking, making some of these functionalities. And so when you say app, you think about, you're saying people think it's just like a mobile app, but what you're doing is significantly deeper into the organization itself.
Yeah. And so some of this is, I guess, to try to understand holistically why that's so challenging. A lot of that has to do with the underlying technologies that allow all the things that we take for granted to work in this world, like how we can move money around into each other's accounts, how credit cards work, how these things. And there's lots of really great technology that does that. It is certainly robust. So for example, I can't recall ever seeing a mistake in any of my accounts, but it's also big, right? And so it's tough to innovate from a user experience perspective. And that's where kind of the digital side of it comes to play. And then there's always the aspect of organizational, call it size, and all the kind of momentum that can create or stall, I guess, in certain extents, make it challenging, right? To really move quickly when customers or users like you and I demand better, right? And different experiences, more unified experiences. And so where we come to play is we're trying to help banks build and deliver on these kind of experiences through their products. We partner with some of the bigger kind of what we'll call core systems that allow kind of the underlying infrastructure to work. So yeah, I guess that's how I think about where innovation can happen. It can certainly happen through the entire stack, but where Amount is focused is on the product level for the banks, what services, what kind of products they provide, and then how that experience is just really seamless and world-class.
Very cool. There's been a lot of consolidation in the banking industry since 2008 and even before that, right? Like First Chicago and even Bank One and Fifth Third and all of that, like even in the late 90s. are you focused primarily on some of those smaller banks, or is it like the mid-sized banks? Where's your target customer?
I said earlier that we're a startup about 2.5 years in, and I would say that we are still on the journey to really figure out like what our precise target customer is. Like a lot of startups in the early days, you are adaptable to the types of customers that you can take on. And we currently have customers that you would consider very, very large banks, like a top five, logo with certainly huge amount of assets and many, many customers. And then we have what, we call mid and down market partners as well. The thing that we're learning and what we're discovering, and some of this may seem obvious, but you learn through the journey, is that while the technology that we can provide and the product we can provide is like fundamentally the same, how you go to market, how you implement and deliver for those two types of customers, let's say up market and down market, are fundamentally different. And in software, that's the difference between enterprise software, or let's call it small business software, or consumer software, right? And we are constantly learning and improving how to do both. And we think that there's an opportunity for us to do both.
That's great. Your background, very impressive, obviously, but it's a very unique experiences that you have of some of the most iconic names here in Chicago, like Grainger. Anybody from Chicago knows Grainger, right? There's a Grainger building somewhere within your neighborhood somewhere, right? So,
yeah.
But even Cars.com, Innova, Belly. So you've got a very diverse background, right? It's not like one industry you're stuck with.
Yeah.
What were you thinking? What was your intention with that? Is that something you started out with the intention of like being diverse and being, having all these different types of experiences?
Yeah. Like, Fred, what are you thinking? Right. Okay. It's not like I had a plan, let's say earlier in my career, where I'm like, I don't want to be in one industry. That was not a plan. I think, but maybe it is like a little bit more thoughtful in my last few kind of roles that I've taken on. And I think it's because, what I do is I do technology, right? I know how to build technology. I know how to build processes and organizations that hopefully are productive and happy and growing and driving value to the organization. And I know how to do that in a technology context. I think over the years, I've also learned how to be in a technology executive at a company. And I think that's important because often, the other executives at the table don't have a technology background, and I need to partner with them to help us collaborate and get to the right place. And so I've developed that skill. And so I think that's allowed me to consider all industries, because what's probably true over the last whatever decade, 2 decades, is that all companies, regardless of industry, are in some ways becoming technology companies.
Well, the ones that want to survive.
Yeah. Yes. And in some ways, we'll call it the skills or the experience I bring, the patterns that I can bring to the table, just work across industry. Now, every time I start a new role in a new industry, I'm the dumbest person in the room when it comes to the business. And, I spend a lot of time trying to learn the business, the customer, how we do sales, how we do all these things. One of the first things I try to do when I join an organization is try to get as close to the customer as possible. Sometimes that actually means going to meet customers, but a really easy way is to sit with sales, go on sales calls, and listen in with customer service. For example, when I first started at Cars, like within the first few months, I hit the road with a salesperson and just followed them around from dealer to dealer, and you just learn a lot. When I started at Belly, I myself and had my team sit and listen in with the customer service team, and you just hear things and you learn things. And what's interesting is not only do you learn, but it's often inspiring. So you kind of hear all the complaints, but you also hear like all the good things too, right? how we're doing good things and how we're helping and the problems we're solving. And that's always energizing, right?
That's brilliant. When I worked at Ameritech, they put the developers in the customer service phone call room. I'm like, why am I here? Right? Like,
Mm.
well, most of what we did was the billing function, right? And so like understanding what their confusion was, and I whenever I talk to like, the roundtable that I host around innovation, people are like, well, how do you find out what's wrong with your business? It's real easy. Go sit in the support room, right? Whoever's getting those calls, right? To your point, though, is like it's not all negative. There are people calling thankful or when they get resolution or just even clarity, right? Some of it is they just didn't understand. It was a misunderstanding. And then they're like, oh, I get it now. That makes perfect sense. But it's also great places to say, here's where we can make big moves. Here's where we can make little moves, right? And then just some nice things to hear. So I think that's fantastic.
Yeah, I mean, like I'll share a quick story related to that. So when I got to Belly, I was trying to learn the business, obviously the operations and all of that, and I had heard from my team, the product and engineering team that we just have like lots of production issues, right? And so I had the team sit with customer service and listen in, and I kind of thought the goal was to identify the problems, right? That's what I wanted out of that. What ended up happening was you certainly do some of that, but as I mentioned, you just get inspired by the work that's happening and the value you're creating. Because often as people who build product and do software, you're so disconnected to the end user. But the surprising thing, and this is what I would suggest everyone like do, is it actually created an improvement in team morale because now you're sitting with this person that kind of sits in the customer service team, but you see them, you have coffee with them, you have lunch with them, you say hi to them, how was your weekend? And you realize that this is a person who's trying to do their job. And you realize, oh, like what I built, the software I built, in some ways like helps them, but in some ways like causes them problems. And there's empathy that's built, and the team comes back with like a lot of kind of connections and energy around the company and what we're doing to try to help each other. And they come back with this huge like list of ideas on what to do. And I think this is the key moment in leadership, I think, where, we'll call it, some leaders may take a look at that list and go, well, it's not a priority because we still got to do this deliverable from a product feature perspective. What I did was I said, we're going to fix all those things. And I did that at risk, right? Because it was time and effort taken away from something else.
It definitely isn't going to make you very popular with the product owners.
Right. But as leaders, you can't say that is an important thing we were going to do to try to understand our operations and our problems with our customers. Allow all this kind of empathy and connection to build, create energy, come back with this pile of things we should fix, and then go, thanks for that. We're not doing that. Right. And so I think it's important to follow through on the outcomes as well.
You're not only like you're connecting the dots between what everybody does, but you're also building relationships. I think that's brilliant. And I'm just curious, Fred, because as Patrick mentioned, you've worked for some really large organizations like Granger and then startups like Belly. Has that kind of changed your perspective on the type of talent that you now bring into the organization?
Yeah, look, I mean, so I'm hesitating because I'm trying to answer that in an eloquent way. So, okay, I guess like the short version of it is like I think there is certainly different talent that fits different types of companies and different phases of companies. And I think like some people might, I think prior to having my personal experiences in like early stage smaller companies versus very large, more established companies, I might have said something like, well, so and so, you fit this company more, or you fit this company more because you like process versus you don't. I might have said something very, honestly, that's too simplistic, right? And I think that there's value in having a diverse perspective and a set of experiences as you build out like really like a productive team. And by diverse, I don't mean only in race and all these kind of things and gender and all that. I mean, like diverse backgrounds, diverse perspectives on do you actually, I look for people on how, whether they like to plan or not and things like that. And I think like through the years, I've learned how I am and what my preferences are. And I'm constantly looking for people who are like not like me and not necessarily exactly like me. And so there's certainly value in having people with experiences in all those different ways. And I think that the mistake that some companies might make or leaders may make is that they will equate what I'm talking as if that is not a culture fit, and that I think is just too it's too reductive, right? It's not really about that, right? It's about, can this person with their set of experiences and backgrounds and skills add value to what we're doing because it is actually different from what we're doing. And it's a recognition that that's important, right? Otherwise you're just going to get the same people who do the same things the same way, right?
It's a great point on modalities, right? Like you're like from the startup and from more established businesses, there are people I think that can do both. I think at times in the startups, it's a little bit more vague, right? It's a little bit more paint your own picture,
Mhm.
right? It's not so much here's a direct thing. But to your point of like, I think why I've been successful with growing my businesses is I find great compliments, right? People who are their strengths are my weaknesses and my strengths are their weaknesses. And that builds a mutual respect for each other of, hey, you're really great at this. I suck at it.
Yeah.
I really, I really appreciate you for what you bring to the table.
Yeah.
And I do think I was on a phone call with a bunch of entrepreneurs yesterday, and one guy was talking. He's like, I think I need to find this person. I'm like, but that's you. You got you. Go find somebody else, right? Like you don't need another you. And I think people get that. I think there's a natural understanding of like, hey, like I have terrible follow through on things, right? So it's like finding people who can, like, paperwork's my nightmare, right? Like anything involved, like kick the door, I'm good at that.
Yeah.
Filling out paperwork, probably not for me.
Agreed to all that. But so here's what's like the really funny part to all of this. Like, let's take process, or let's take lots of process versus little process as an example. Every early stage startup I've been in or have talked to or advised or anything like that, they all ask for, guess what? More process, right? Because we need to get organized. We got to have whatever. And then for every big company that I've worked for or run into, guess what they want less of? Process, right? So it's like there's sort of this aspect of like grass is always greener on the other side, and but having said that though, like the experiences that either will bring to the table, I think is important, right? So
Yeah, the too much, too little, right? Is just, the Goldilocks situation of like, oh, it's too hot, it's too cold. It's never just right. And if you do, you end up falling asleep and bears show up and almost slaughter you. So that doesn't sound like a good outcome. I always, to your point, it's always interesting to me how enterprise organizations will say, oh, I want to be more like a startup. And it's like, you know what a startup wants to be? More like you.
yeah,
You've got established client, you've got, revenue, you've got, right. And it's like, I tell people, it's like being on third base, wishing you were on first, right? Like just focus on getting home, right? Like don't worry about that. So anyways, it's pretty cool stuff. So I'm interested, you've got a big perspective, you got a lot of different industries. What is the hottest thing in your industry right now that you got your CPU totally focused on?
so specifically in the industry that I'm in right now, from like we'll call it like a product perspective, it's a product called buy now pay later, BNPL. It feels like it's the hottest thing. It's also the newer or the newest kind of thing in terms of like a bank product offering. And for those listening who don't know what BNPL is, it is it often you will experience it as part of the checkout flow in some kind of e-commerce website where you're offered a button that will say often, 4 payments, 0 interest, that kind of thing. And there are a number of fintech startups that have kind of pioneered this and innovated this and are kind of leading the way. And the banks or the larger financial institutions are trying to figure out a way to participate, right? And so that's where a company like Amount, a platform like Amount can help. And that's certainly part of our strategy right now.
Very cool. So what is your single biggest challenge right now? Like, what's the thing that, like, if you could solve one thing, it would have a huge impact on the organization as a whole?
Yeah. So I'm going to cheat and maybe mention two things. I'll say first, like at a company high level, as a newer company, again, I think it's normal to adapt and iterate and focus, figure out where to focus, what's the key strategy. I would say that we are on that journey. It is something that myself and the executive team are constantly working through and talking through. It's very important that we nail that. Otherwise, we run the risk of just going after too many things at once, right? Which is, new, old, big, or small is always potentially a problem, right, in a company. For me personally, who, I lead technology and product and engineering, it is always about talent. It is not only hiring, but also growing the great talent that I already have and just constantly trying to improve the team. A lot of times people will ask me, like, Fred, what is your vision? What is your mission while you're there? And people might be a little surprised to hear me say that my goal is to build a world-class team that can build world-class products over and over again. And that's maybe a little surprising to people because they expect to hear from me something like about the product or about the technology or whatever. But what I have learned is that, I mean, I've done this long enough where I have shipped code in upwards of 50 different languages. I actually listed this out one time. I have worked through any number of different architectural patterns that at the time everyone said was the best. I have worked in any number of development processes from old school waterfall to new school agile to whatever. And like none of that matters. And the only thing that really matters is, do you have a great team? And a great team will overcome any of those things. And a great team will adapt to any of those, challenges. And so doing that is the thing that I'm most focused on.
It's fantastic. And I think you bring up a great point about finding people who can get things done, right? Of like people who can actually care about each other, right? Who work well together. I know there's a lot of passion around agile, as you mentioned. Somehow we were able to land on the moon without agile. I don't know how that was possible. Must have been luck.
Yeah.
Right. Or just committed, dedicated, serious people, right?
Mm-hmm.
Do you think it's harder to find people like that today? Do you think the commitment level, like the comfortability with rigor and discipline, because that's really what we're talking about when it comes to good engineering, is it's like this old house, right? Do you have the discipline to go backwards, to go forward instead of just keep meandering on?
So you ask, like, is it difficult to find those people?
More difficult. It's always been difficult, right?
Yeah. Well, look, okay. So it has always been challenging to hire great talent because, as we all know, the market is competitive. But I don't think that, so I guess like that is like a market statement, but in the sense of like, do these people exist? I think there are way more people that exist like this than, people think. I think that most people, most engineers, most product managers want to do their best work for the company, for the good of the company and for the good of the team and for each other. They desire to put their effort into it, whether that's time, heart, soul, mind. And I think many organizations unfortunately crush that and squeeze it out of them. And my goal is to try to create a playing field that allows for everyone to bring their best work and cultivate. And the goal is like that is hard enough in itself, but like maybe like what's even harder is like how you then align all that to like this company outcome that we want as well, right? And so, I mean, at the end, that's management, right? So that's kind of what I mean by that's what I focus on.
That's great. And I think that plays into what you said before about there's the right sizing of process. But I think one of the things that I see most organizations are not doing is creating the clarity that, to your point of like getting people to be able to, like, we just recently had a great podcast guest, Ed Wagoner from JLL, and he talked a lot about creating the environment for people to bring their best self, bring everything they've got, and creating that clarity. Because I do think you spot on with so many management or old school structures that would be crippling, right? Where you're not going to bring 100%, you're going to bring maybe 70%, because if you bring the other part and it gets crushed, you're going to get hurt, and you're going to back out of it. And so there is that balance of structure and clarity. And one of the things you talked about as well is like how important with working with the fully remote workforce, communication, right? Where like you can't just say, hey, well, it's harder on Zoom, right? You've got to be deliberate about your communication strategies. You have to constantly think, who else needs to know this, right? Like, how do I get that information to them? And one of the things you mentioned before was the communication has to be documented and asynchronous, right?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, comment on that a little bit. I think for sure when you're in a remote workforce or even a hybrid remote or non-remote workforce, communication has always been challenging, right? And as leaders, many leaders fail to communicate well, and I am one of those as well, because it's really hard. It's time consuming. How many of us have sat down? We know what we want to say. We start that email or that Slack message, and it's just hard to write these thoughts out in a way that is, clear and all these things. And then you go, I'll come back to that, right? And then a week passes, 2 week passes, and now your communication isn't out. And so this is, to the point of being like thoughtful and purposeful, you have, it is not something you just like hammer out, right? You have to like actually work on it and be purposeful about it. And it's definitely, I think, super important. And that's kind of like top level leadership communication, right? And that doesn't even account for the day-to-day kind of project work and the different tasks that are part of the project and so forth. And when you have a remote workforce or a hybrid remote workforce like I do, working that way is really important, because I guess like not working that way, I guess I'll say like the extreme opposite is having a very meeting centered culture is by definition non-inclusive, right? So one, if you're not at the meeting, then you missed out. But how many times does this happen where there's 3 people in the office, 1 person on Zoom, and they're not included in the conversation, right? So one way to like allow kind of like the playing field to be level is like we can still have the meeting, but the source of truth is document, right? And that allows this to kind of level the playing field, allow people to be included, but also the asynchronous nature allows for the work to happen kind of like whenever it needs to happen, as opposed to 9:30 Central Time, when I might have someone Pacific time and someone Eastern time and someone whatever time. I say all that, but I also want to be clear, we are on a journey to get there. And, it is as much behavior as it is culture, as it is, people doing the work. There's skill as well involved in doing this. But, I feel like it's important. I think it'll be an important competitive advantage for any organization that can do this well.
The communication component is a competitive advantage. Yeah, totally agree. Totally agree.
Especially in a remote hybrid environment.
But it almost seems like it's more the potential's higher there, because it is the like Slack channels, right? There are these types of virtual rooms where these conversations can remain long term, as opposed to somebody was out today. And it's not even so much the hybrid or any of that, like, hey, this person just had another meeting and now you've got a gap in information, so that when you start executing on whatever that to do was that came out of the meeting, 1 of 4 people is unaware and they're operating in a whole different understanding. And that's really where the defects start showing up from like the human processes of like, this person wasn't on the same page. And it's like, oh, well, why did this blow up? And it's like, nobody told me we're deploying tomorrow, right? So I didn't have any idea. I didn't have my team prepared. So it's tremendous. One thing I always lean in on as well when it comes to competitive advantages, it's developing leaders in your organization, right? So leadership is something that just you're going to get, I call it a 10X kind of thing, right? Where if everybody in your organization at least can lead themselves and then potentially lead 1 to 2 other people, I think you're unstoppable because so few organizations spend any time on it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Totally agree.
Awesome. Well, Fred, I really appreciate you joining us on the podcast today. Great stuff.
Yeah.
Some of the big takeaways for me is one, get close to your customers and get close to the people who get close to your customers.
Yeah.
Know what their pain points are. Empathizing with the customer is great. Empathizing with the person servicing that customer is better, right?
Yeah.
Because if you can empower them.
They're your teammates. They're your friends, right?
Yeah. And then communication, obviously a big part of this. And thanks for sharing your vision on the buy now, pay later, right? Awesome. Well, I appreciate you being on today. It's really tremendous. And again, congratulations on all your success. You're an inspiration. I think the things you've accomplished, especially as a technologist and a business person, and understanding how to marry those two things, I think is an inspiration. And should be to many of our young technologists out there, knowing that they should bridge that gap if they really want to get to the higher levels of success.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you. I appreciate the kind words. Thank you for having me on. It's been fun.
Thank you, Fred.
Thank you.
Awesome. We also want to thank you, our listeners. We really appreciate everyone taking the time to join us.
And if you'd like to receive new episodes as they're published, you can subscribe by visiting our website at dragonspears.com/podcast or find us on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts.
This episode was sponsored by Dragon Spears and produced by Dante32.